All right, I am just leaving CrossFit here. I got a topic from Reddit. Let's get these windows cleared up. It's a super foggy morning. And then I'm sitting in the car after CrossFit, so my windows are already a little mangled. But yeah, it's crazy out this morning. There's just so much fog. But anyway, you're not here for the fog. You're here for the software engineering topics. So the topic from Reddit is about collaborating in teams, and specifically this person's asking about the idea that they're talking about behavioral interviews, and they're saying that it feels like, this is my sort of understanding from their question, that they're being asked in behavioral interviews things like, tell me about a time when you worked in a team. And I think they're kind of curious because it seems like maybe from their experience, they've been working on teams that are more like a group of individuals working on individual tasks, and less like a sort of cohesive team working together on things. So it seems like they're looking for some insight into, like, if that's been my experience, how do I go about answering behavioral interview questions like this? So I wanted to talk about this. I made a video recently on talking about my experiences leading teams and some of the different dynamics I've seen where sometimes it's felt like we're entirely cohesive teams working together on the same thing, and other times where I have teams that kind of feels like we're making progress, but everyone's kind of got individual things they're working on. So it's more of like a broad approach to tackle a bunch of different surface area. And I have like my own personal preference about how I like leading teams, and sometimes based on the amount of work and stuff that's coming in, we don't have a lot of, I guess, like say, because if all of it has to get done, then things have to be spread a little bit more broadly. But from the perspective of the engineers working on the teams, like, how can you like translate this into things to talk about in behavioral interviews? So I think the first thing I should say before I even go into explaining some thoughts on this is that if you want questions answered, please just drop them in the comments, and happy to try and navigate that with you. If you want something answered that's a little bit more detailed, or you want to keep it anonymous, look for Dev Leader on social media. I'm basically on every platform. Just send me a message, or Nick Cosentino on LinkedIn. My LinkedIn profile is it's a premium profile, so it should allow you to message me, if I've had other people do it. So please go ahead and do that if you're interested. But my thoughts on this. So I think the first thing is that as an engineering manager who's been interviewing engineers for like 12 years, you have to understand that behavioral interview questions are to serve a purpose, like to measure behavior, right? And the idea is that as interviewers, we want to be able to figure out what it's going to be like for you to work on the team. And the reality is, like, there's different ways that you could assess this, but with behavioral interview questions, it's kind of like, if we understand past performance, then hopefully we can use that to sort of project what it would be like in the future. So with that said, sometimes like in behavioral interview questions, it seems like at least this person who posted this on Reddit seems to understand, like, hey, look, I think someone's looking for something in this question, and I'm not sure if I'm able to like provide that. And so, I mean, that's a good insight, because I think some people, and when I say some, I mean, from my experience, a like majority of people almost seem to get into like the technical details far too much in behavioral interview questions. And like, I don't blame people, right? Like, as software engineers, we're describing technical systems we've built. You know, someone will say, you know, talk me through this project or whatever. So, you know, you're trying to say like, oh, like I used Postgres, and then like we had this technology, and like I built this thing, like, and you're getting into very, very specific details about the system, and often that's really not the point of the question, right? It's a behavioral interview question, not like let me grill you on like the technology you picked. Now, someone might get you to try and explain the technology you picked, and maybe what they're trying to do is see how you can like articulate some of these things to an audience that was not part of building the system, right? So they might be looking for some of your communication skills and things like that. But when we're talking about these types of questions, like tell me about a time where you worked on a team doing whatever, I think that this person's like kind of like thinking about it the right way, where they're saying, I want to be able to talk about it like a team, like where I was working on things together. But even, I would say, even if a lot of the work that you're doing feels more individual, I would hope that you can try to find ways to think about things in a sense where like the team is brought together. So what I mean by that is like, there's a few different angles I want to look at. And I'll just kind of go over them quickly as they're coming to my mind. But one of them is like the actual sort of physical team that you've been assigned to. That's probably how this person's thinking about it. But the other thing that I would mention too is like people work on different projects, potentially in different teams, right? Sorry, I got to move lanes here, and I thought this person was trying to merge into my lane. But you might be working on a dedicated project for some period of time, and like you're collaborating with other teams, and like you could think about that team as sort of like a virtual team and navigate some things that way. So those are two like sort of high level ideas I want to kind of chat through, especially if you find yourself working in these situations where you're like, yeah, I'm on this team, but we're kind of doing individual work. So if you find that you're on a team doing individual work and you're like, I don't really know how to answer a question like this because anytime I go to talk about stuff I've done on this team, it was almost like working in isolation, you could try to think about things from a different angle. And instead of looking at, I don't know, specifically the projects being done, you could look at the different parts of the deliverables. So for example, I'm assuming on your teams you do pull requests and code reviews. Like these are going to be something where you're collaborating with other people on the team. Design document reviews. You could be doing retrospectives on things. So even if you're working on individual things, do you do sprints with retrospectives? Could you talk about some of the things that happen in the overlap there? So these might seem like maybe contrived or silly examples, but my point is that if the regular coding work that you're doing, I've got to turn my window defogger on. It's nuts. If the regular coding work you're doing, you feel like there's not a ton of overlap with other team members, can you start to find some of the other stuff that you're doing where there is overlap? Okay, so you could probably chat through some of this, because odds are it's not just tell me about a time you worked in a team, right? Like that's like, what about it? If you were to think from an interviewer's perspective, like that's not going to tell them very much. But if they were to say work in a team where, and then they give you some constraint, you could say like where a deadline wasn't being met, right? And then they're trying to see like how do you navigate this? How do you bring this kind of thing to the surface? How do you, you're on a team, how do you bring awareness to other people on the team? Do you take leadership in trying to make other people aware and driving progress? Well, I'm just making up some of the examples from earlier with like the code reviews and stuff, right? You could say like, hey, like I was working on this thing. You don't have to highlight necessarily to the interviewer that it was a little bit more in isolation. But if you were doing the code reviews, right? So you have teammates that are not participating, or they're falling behind, they're not engaged on the pull request. Like you might have some sort of timeline that you're working towards. How did you raise awareness to those teammates? How did you get them engaged, right? It's like, it's less about the specific of the problem and the scenario and more about like what you did, if that makes sense. So it's not like they're going to say, tell me about a time like where you were using SQL and programming in C# and then had like a deadline that was looming. Like those things have nothing to do with the behavioral part. So the fact that they're bringing up a team is like they're giving you some context that they're trying to think about. How are you interacting with other individuals that are probably your peers, potentially different types of stakeholders? They might even ask you specific questions about, working in a team and missing deadlines or like looming deadlines and talking about different stakeholders and stuff involved. So I think that you just have to kind of look at potentially the different phases or aspects of the work that you're doing if you're finding that your teams are kind of disjoint like this. So that's kind of one way to look at it. And again, I think the best way to kind of prepare for this kind of stuff for interviews is kind of like, it's what this person's doing. It's kind of going through the thought exercise of saying, look, I know I'm going to get questions about working in a team. And I feel like the work that I've done on teams is disjoint in terms of like kind of working in isolation. And like sometimes that kind of thing's a little bit outside of your control, right? Like I'm even thinking about some of the teams I have right now. I have in some cases, individuals working on just very different things in their space. And I have some where people are like literally working on the same thing together. So there's both. But you might find from your experience, it's been very kind of isolated within the team. And sure, that might feel challenging, but the thing that I'm saying here is like, before you go interview, anticipate some of these questions, right? If you can think through ahead of time, I'm going to get teamwork-based questions. I don't really understand the team dynamic that well from what I've been doing. Like, spend some extra time ahead of your interviews to try and think through these scenarios. And that's going to lead me to the second kind of example I wanted to walk through, was with like working on projects with other teams. So again, you might say, okay, in my dedicated team that I've been assigned to, there's 8 of us. I'm just making this up, right? There's 8 of us, and most of my work is done kind of in isolation within the team. And then I got assigned to this project. None of my other teammates are on it. I'm kind of representing my team as I contribute to this other CrossTeam initiative. So the nice thing is that you're actually being given this additional opportunity to talk about a team. And generally, I would say in CrossTeam initiatives, like if you've been working in isolation, it's probably a little bit easier to find the collaboration points when you're doing cross-team stuff. And if you're like, well, no, they still assign me some dedicated work. Okay, but like, who assigned you that? How did the requirements come up? How did someone explain the requirements? How did you explain how you were delivering those requirements to the stakeholder of that other team, right? There's a lot more of these potentially obvious points where there's crossover with other people. Sometimes in our day-to-day work, it's like, well, it's only really when my pull request goes up, or it's only really when we were doing the design doc. Otherwise, like, I'm kind of just working in isolation. But like, those are still good examples of doing stuff in teams. It's just that they might not like stand out to you. But when you're doing cross-team stuff, the fact that these other individuals are potentially not on your team, they might stand out as more like obvious opportunities. But the same kind of concept applies, right? It's always going to be, tell me about a time where you're working on a team, and so there's your constraints. And then like, what was the scenario? So looming deadline, it could be, and someone wasn't picking up the pace. It could be that you had a conflict within the team. It could be like, there's always a scenario that they're trying to get you to explain, but the fact that you're on a team is just framing it up, right? And that framing, the constraints that they're generally talking about, is that you have peers with you. Because sometimes in like some interview questions, they might frame it like, hey, you're the person who's leading something. Okay, so we're looking for how you lead in a position where it's a little bit more obvious that you have leadership expectations, right? It could be like, tell me a time you were mentoring someone on a project. It could be a time where you were the team lead on a project, right? They're putting these constraints on the question for you to navigate them that way, because they're looking for that perspective where you were leading something. Now, it's not that they're not looking for leadership examples when they ask you about times where you're working on a team, but they actually might be trying to gauge, like, do you take initiative, right? So tell me about a time you're working on a team, and the idea there is probably just like, you're working with people that are your peers on something, and then some constraints. So then there was a difference of opinions. Like, how did you navigate that? So let's go back to the code review example, right? Because like I said, probably most people are doing pull requests and code reviews, at least within their teams. So the project specifically, just because other people weren't directly contributing to that and you were doing it mostly in isolation, okay, a code review comes up. Now someone's disagreeing with how you design something, or how you're doing your test coverage, or that you started refactoring stuff and maybe you should have done that in a separate pull request, whatever, right? So now they're basically just framing up like you had a disagreement with peers. What did you do? The reason I'm kind of explaining this to you with examples where you're like, oh, that might seem kind of silly, like whatever, is because in my opinion, as someone who's interviewing, the specifics don't matter that much. The specific about what the project was or what, that scenario. I don't need the details of that. I don't need you to get hyper specific. What's going on here? Oh, there's like, I guess there was a little accident or like cars pulled over, but there was also like a utility truck in the ditch, and it looked like it was part of it, but I think it was just coincidence it was pulled over there. Anyway, so I used like that code review example just in this conversation because like that's probably something common you've experienced, right? And the point is that I'm curious in understanding how you navigate conflict. Or there might be situations where there's like indecisiveness on teams, right? So like, okay, people can't make this, like people can't come to an agreement, not necessarily that they're like arguing, but it's like, hey, there's 3 paths forward, like all of them seem okay. What do we do, right? Like, okay, well, someone's got to make a decision. Did you step up and say, okay, we're going to go down this path, take sort of a initiative on it, and then own the responsibility? So they might follow up and say, okay, so within your group, within your team, because that's how we're framing the question, you took the initiative. Did you go do it? And if so, like, did it work out? Because if it didn't, did you own the responsibility of that? Did you say, okay, I was the one who called the shot on going down that path. We ended up trying it. It didn't work. And did you just say, well, not my problem now, and kind of walk away? Or did you own up and say, yep, that didn't work, but we had these 2 other ideas we considered before, so I propose we tried one of the other ones, and that seemed to work, and you can kind of chat through how, you went and implemented that. So this is probably easier for me to say than it is for some people to understand as directly as I mean it, but like, I think it's really important to understand like why people are asking certain behavioral interview questions. So again, that's a good practice thing is so I have a whole course available on this kind of stuff on Dome Train. So if you watch my main Dev Leader channel, I introduce my courses in every single video. So I'll say, hi, I'm Nick. I'm an engineering manager at Microsoft. And then before I get into the content, I mention courses so that people know they're available at least. It's like, 2 seconds to say it. And that way, if you're not interested, great, move on. If you are, they exist. But one of them is on behavioral interviews. And honestly, I think the biggest opportunity with some of these things is kind of on two fronts. One is like, just get comfortable being able to tell stories. And I don't mean like make them up. I mean, be comfortable with stories that you have from your career, or if you're new in your career, from like school, from boot camp, from projects you worked on. Like, get comfortable knowing those things, recalling them, being able to talk about them, because if you can do that part, and then the second part, which is like understanding what people are trying to inquire about when they ask you a behavioral interview question, I find what you're able to do is you hear the question, you go, okay, I know that the interviewer is trying to extract this kind of information about me, right? They're trying to say, how do you work in teams? They're trying to say, how do you act as an informal leader? They're trying to say, how do you handle conflict? So they have a goal with their question. So now you can extract that, and then you fall back to, okay, I have all of these different scenarios from my experience, right? Projects I've worked on, I can talk about challenges in teams, like I got all these different things. Can I find one that I feel comfortable bringing up, that I can align with the question that's being asked, and do it clearly and succinctly? Because if you can do it, but it's going to take you 20 minutes to like kind of build up to getting to that point in the story, like that's maybe not a good option. So I think it's really important to have a high level of comfort with your stories from your career, and then a clear understanding of what these types of questions are after. And this takes practice, right? Like, especially for some people, if you're not used to doing this, like I could totally understand why, like I said in the beginning of this, why people fall back to, okay, someone asked me about a project I've worked on, so I'm just going to tell them all the technology choices. And like you feel you're answering the question, right? They said, tell me about a project, but you're missing the fact that they said, and their focus is actually where you were, had a difference of opinions with the lead, right? So you might go, okay, I know I disagreed with Jimmy on this project, but let me spend 90% of the time talking about the technology, and then 10% of the time is like, and there was this guy, Jimmy, and he had a different opinion, and he was senior, and we went with his choice. Like, it's not really the way you go about it. They're interested in like the other direction. 10% about some of the details, 90% about how you navigated that situation with Jimmy. So I find, like, for myself, when I was interviewing, after leaving the startup that I was at, going to Microsoft, I applied to Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, basically just the big tech companies. And what was nice was that because I had been spending a long time interviewing, was like the behavioral questions, like understanding what people are after, that seems mostly, I don't want to say obvious to me, that's not like fair to say, but it's more comfortable for me to go, I know what this person is trying to get at, I think. But what I really had to practice for myself was making sure I had my scenarios ready. And there would be times where, like, in an interview, I'd be like, they'd ask me, and I'm like, I know I have a really good story for this, and it's just, I blank on it, right? So in my opinion, if you want to be really prepared, have a lot of different stories, because if you're like me and you blank on this kind of stuff, like I don't do well, like writing exams, I'm very bad at, or I shouldn't say bad, that's not a good way to describe it. Like, I'm very uncomfortable when it comes to writing exams. And I think that interviews are similar, like in a high stress kind of thing that's not common for me. I'll do things like blank out or just get nervous, and it's just because I don't practice doing them. So if you're like me and you want to prevent that kind of thing from having a really big impact, spend more time getting more examples together. That way, if you blank on something, it's like, okay, well, I know I had a really good story for that, but like, instead of being like, I can't answer your question now, it's like, okay, well, what's another example? I know I got a bunch. So I hope that's kind of helpful in thinking through, like, again, I know it started off talking about working on teams, working more in isolation versus cohesively. But when it comes to interviewing questions, I think there's just different ways to navigate that. You can explicitly try to look for the different touch points in your team interactions or on projects where you are doing this kind of stuff, and highlight that. In my opinion, if I were interviewing someone, uh, I feel like they could completely, and not like in a malicious way, but they could completely dodge the fact that they were working mostly on individual items. In fact, you could even potentially bring that up, depending on what the question is. You might be able to even say, like, hey, the last team I was on, I actually did notice that we worked mostly on individual items. But to answer your question specifically, when we were working together, here is part of this project where we did this, and here's how I navigated whatever the scenario is, right? The conflict between team members, the team lead we couldn't agree with, the tight deadlines, the other stakeholders. So there's ways to do it, right? So hope that helps. Interviewing's tricky. Definitely something you want to practice and kind of build up that comfort level. So thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.